Alright, so welcome to this lesson where we're going to take a look at building a 3D cube inside a CSS. And also what we want to do is, as we're building it in the CSS, we also want to be building this in the 3D application. So we're doing it in both worlds. Also, what I'm going to be doing is first of all showing you a little gotcha right here, which can get very confusing very quickly if you're actually building, complex scenes and so forth. So this is a very important principle to understand and to comprehend how CSS 3D works in the browser. So what I'm going to go ahead and do is open up this file, which is CSS 3D cube.html, and I've got it open in my browser right here, so you'll just see it is a square that's red. And if I open this up in Dreamweaver, you'll be able to see it's just a div with an ID of plane. I'm pointing to it, making the width and the height 200 pixels and a background color of red, and I'm setting the perspective on the body element right here. So very quickly, what I want to do is I'm going to say WebKit, so I'm going to put the WebKit prefix version of the transform CSS property on here. So I'm going to say WebKit transform, and then what I'm going to do is use the translate x function, and then I'm going to set this to 100 pixels. So once I've gone ahead and done that, let's save this now, go ahead and preview this in the browser. So what I've done is I've moved this over 100 pixels. So the x-axis is going from the left side to the right side. The y-axis is going from top to bottom, and the z-axis is the one that's coming out at you, perpendicular to the screen. So let's go ahead, rotate this now. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to put this rotate y function in front of the translate x function. So I'm going to say rotate y, and I'm going to put in here 90 degrees. Okay, so I'm going to say rotate y first of all, then we're going to move it on the x-axis. So let's go ahead and preview this in the browser. So I'm going to go ahead and hit refresh. You'll see it's rotated at 90 degrees as I've asked it to, but something very strange has now happened, because let's go ahead and change the translate x value to 1000. You'll notice it's getting further and further away from us. It's no longer going from left to right, but we're still translating on the x-axis. So what is actually happening here? Because this obviously can get very confusing. So what we need to do is take a look at Blender first of all, and what I'm going to do is add in a plane. So that is our div element. I like to think of divs as planes, which they pretty much are. They're very flat, but when you combine them together, you can build really cool stuff like cubes and all kinds of stuff. So here we have our plane, or our div element. In this case, it's just representing a face of our object. And what I want to do is rotate this now. So I'm just going to say, okay, well, the first thing I'm going to do is rotate on the y-axis by 90 degrees. And if you want this little transform panel right here, just go to the view menu down here and go to properties right here, and it will actually show up this little panel, and it's going to be very useful throughout this tutorial, so make sure you have that open if you're going to use Blender and so forth. And now you'll notice that something very strange has actually happened. You'll notice that the x-axis, which is the red line right here, that's still the same on the grid, and also the green line, and also the z-axis is still the same. However, when we click on this actual object that I've created, this plane, you'll notice now that the red arrow, which symbolizes the x-axis, or moving on the x-axis, is now going down the z-axis. Now that's very strange, because as you saw before, when we now move the x-axis, or when we say translate x, we are actually moving on the z-axis. And don't forget that you need to be in top view to accurately represent this in the browser. So as you can see, the z-axis, the x and the y have stayed the same. However, when I actually move the object on the x-axis, it's actually moving on the z-axis, which is what's happening in the browser. And that's because the translate functions are relative to the object itself. So if you rotate that object, it's also going to change all of your translate functions that you have, because it's relative to the object, and that's what I've set down here. It's local or relative to the object, instead of being on the global axis. Now the global axis never changed. The X goes from left to right, the Y goes up and down, and the Z comes out at you. But when you actually go onto the object itself, rotate it, you're also changing the way it translates or it moves on the axes. So this is how things can get very, very confusing. You don't want that. You basically want to stick with the global axes as much as possible. That way it makes life a lot easier. So in order to do that, what I'm going to go ahead and do is change the order in which I do this. I'm not going to rotate it first. I'm rather going to move it into position, and then I'm going to rotate it. And that's very, very important that we remember to do that. That way everything stays nice and easy. Now I haven't got to worry about what's happening here and there and so forth. And if I go back into the browser, hit refresh, you'll notice it's rotated 90 degrees, but it's not going further away when I change the translate X function right here. You'll notice it's actually going further over to the right, and also if I decrease that, it will go more to the left. And that's basically it. So just remember the order in which your transform functions are actually written does matter, because when you translate, it's local to the element itself rather than the global axes, and that's very, very important. So to keep everything global, or keep it on the global axes, put the translate functions before the rotate functions, and that way you're just going to save yourself having a massive headache. So once I've gone ahead and done that, what I'm going to do is I'm going to delete this all out now, and I'm going to change this div's ID to viewport. Okay, because right here in Blender what we have is a viewport, and the viewport is our view into the 3D world. I'm also going to delete that plane out right here. So this is why I'm calling the div the viewport, because that is our view into the 3D world. What I want to do is I want to create another div nested inside of here, and I'm going to give that an ID of cube, like so. So the cube is going to be an empty object, which you can actually add inside of Blender. If I go ahead and try and add, and I can add an empty object, so I can say add empty, and then there we go. So now I have an empty object right here. You can't see anything, and that's the whole point. This is just going to be a container. It's going to group all of the planes together, which represent the faces of the cube. It's going to group them together. So then what I can actually do is change or rotate the cube, and that will rotate the object itself rather than the individual faces. So if you're not following me right now, don't worry about it. We'll recap over it when we actually finish this off. So we have our div with an ID of cube, which is grouping together all of our planes, which represent our faces. And of course, with a cube, you have 6 faces. So what I'm going to go ahead and do is create some divs right here, and I'm going to create an ID onto this div, and this div is going to be called front. So this face is actually going to be facing the camera. So let's go ahead and start coding this in the CSS. So we have the div with an ID of viewport, which, as you know, will automatically by default go into orthographic mode unless we tell it to go to perspective mode. So what I'm going to do is put the WebKit prefix on here, and I'm going to say perspective, and then I'm going to change this to say 1000 pixels. That way the translations that I do are actually less obvious and more subtle, which is the type of effect we're trying to go for here. So what I'm going to go ahead and do is just copy that perspective CSS property, and then I want to put a Moz prefix on here, and also a non-prefix version of this CSS property on the bottom. And again, you can take a look at the browser support. I'll be overlaying the browser support so you can see what you need to do to get this to work properly on most browsers that are available. So here you'll be able to see we've got the WebKit, which I've spelt that wrong. There we go. WebKit, perspective 1000 pixels, Moz, perspective 1000 pixels, and then the non-prefix version. Alright, so now we have a viewport that is no longer in orthographic mode, but rather perspective mode, which is good. That's what we want, because it creates a more realistic effect. So the next thing I want to do is I want to look at my cube right here. So I'm going to point to my cube, and then what I want to do is apply the transform style CSS property. Now, why do I want to do that? Well, if we actually take a look at a cube, so I'm just going to add in a cube, you'll notice that we obviously have 6 faces. So our 6 faces are the 6 divs that are going to be the children. Now, if you remember that when you have a child of its parent and it has different transforms, so one's going to be rotated on the y-axis, another one's going to be rotated on the x-axis, and they're all going to be having different transformations, we need them to have their own 3D transformations independent of their parent. So what we need to do is we need to say preserve the 3D, so each one of the faces can have their own transformation so that we can make this cube effect. If you don't do it, all you'll get is just a flat plane again with all of your faces just stacked up next to one another like cards. So we don't want that. So what I'm going to go ahead and do is open up Dreamweaver, and I'm going to say, so I'm going to put that prefix on there, and I'm going to say transform style, and then I'm going to say preserve -3D. So once I've gone ahead and done that, I'm just going to copy that CSS property without the prefix. So this CSS property is available for Mozilla Firefox. Also, Internet Explorer 10 does support the transform style CSS property, but it doesn't support the value of preserve 3D. So that's going to cause a little bit of a problem, but we'll worry about that later. What I want to do now is accompany this transform style CSS property with the transform CSS property. They both have to go together. However, I'm not going to transform it in any way. I'm just going to say rotate on the x-axis by 0 degrees. So I'm not actually going to change anything right here. So I'm just going to say WebKit transform and then rotate on the x-axis 0 degrees. And then we need to provide a mos prefix to the CSS property, and then finally the CSS property on its own with no prefix. Alright, so I've gone ahead and done that. So what I want to do now is focus on the faces. So we've set up our object right here and we've set up our viewport. So now we need to take a look at the faces of this object, because at the moment you can't see this object at all because it doesn't have any visible faces. So what I want to do is I want to go ahead and copy this div element, and I want to paste it in again, and I'm just going to copy those 3 and paste them in again, because we have 6 faces right here for our cube, and we have the front, then the back, and then we can go top, and then the bottom, and then we have the left, and then we have the right. Alright, so now what I'm going to go ahead and do is drop down onto a new line. And right here, what I'm going to do is I'm going to point to all of these faces, because our cube has 6 faces. All the faces are the same size, and I want them to sort of have the same opacity, so this cube is sort of see-through, so we can really get that 3D effect. So I'm just going to say cube, and then I'm going to point to all the div elements inside of that cube element right there. So all of these right here, all these faces, and then I want to set the width to 200 pixels, and I want to set the height to 200 pixels, like so. And then I want to set the opacity to 0.5, so that's going to make the alpha transparency of each one of these faces 50%, so we can sort of see all the other faces as well. So that's going to create a really cool effect. And finally, I want these stack up one on top of each other. So the way you're actually going to achieve that is you're going to say position absolute, because if not, it defaults to relative, and that means that, you know, they can't really stack up on top of one another. It just gets very complicated. So just say position absolute, and that way, if we just quickly put on a border just for demonstrational purposes. 1 pixel solid, and we'll just give it a black border, like so. And then what I'm going to do is open up Safari and hit refresh. And there we go. So we have our viewport, then we have our cube, and then we have our faces. And you'll notice the faces are all the same size, and they all have a 1 pixel border, and they're all stacked on top of one another. Perfect. So then when I start transforming them, they're all transforming from the same position. So that's going to make life a lot easier. So the next thing that I want to go ahead and do is open up Dreamweaver, and I'm going to get rid of the border because that was just for styling purposes. But everything else we're going to keep. So now it's time to start looking at each individual face and putting it into the correct position. Now, once we start adding content to the faces, you will notice there's a bit of a problem, but I'm going to show you how to solve that. However, for the meantime, we're just going to concentrate on actually the faces themselves and the positioning and rotation. So what I'm going to go ahead and do is I'm going to, first of all, point to the front face, and what I'm going to do is set the background color. So we're going to set that to red, otherwise we will not be able to see it. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to move it forward 100 pixels. So I'm just going to use the WebKit prefix on the transform CSS property. However, if you open this file up after the tutorial, you'll notice I'll put in all the other prefixes and obviously the non-prefix version, because basically I just want to concentrate on the positioning and so forth and not necessarily the prefix version of the CSS property. And of course the non-prefix version. So what I'm going to go ahead and do is say WebKit transform. And what I want to do is I don't need to rotate it, because what I'm doing right here is if I open up Blender and I delete this out, we're going to go into top view. So by default you're in top view, and I'm going to add in a plane. So that is our div element right here. And so as you can see, it's added it at the 0 position right here. And I'm going to move this up on the z-axis by 1. So that's going to move it closer to us. Now, why am I going to do that? Well, each face is 200 pixels. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to create another plane down below, another face to our cube, and I'm going to move that down -1. And that way, you'll notice that this point right here, this is our central point in our viewport right here. This point stays in between those two faces. So that way we're sort of keeping everything central. So with our cube, we have a central point, and then when we rotate it, it's rotating around that central point, and that's very, very important. And plus it's going to make it a lot easier for us, because then when we start adding in the side planes, and you know, we're going to rotate them on the y-axis like so, it makes it so much easier. I don't have to then move it up and down and so forth. I don't have to do that. All I have to do is just concentrate on moving it in one direction instead of having to move stuff back down again and so forth. It just makes life a lot easier. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to delete that out, because we've only created our top facing plane right here. So I'm just going to open up Dreamweaver, and here we're going to have WebKit transform, and I'm going to say translate. So again, the order that I'm doing this in, translate Z 100 pixels, like so. I don't need to rotate it because again, we're in top view by default, so that's perfectly fine. It's already facing towards us when we originally load the page. Absolutely fine. No problems with that. Also, just very quickly, what I'm going to do is I'm going to change this to wireframing mode. That way it sort of makes it easier for us to actually see all the other faces. So once I've gone ahead and done that, what I'm going to do is open up Dreamweaver. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to point to the opposite face, which is obviously the back face. Alright. Now, with the back face, what I'm going to go ahead and do is say translate Z, but I'm going to make this -100 pixels. So then, what's happening is, as you've just seen, I'm adding that plane right there, which was already there, but I'm moving it now, and I'm moving it downwards by 100 pixels, or in this case -1 on the z-axis. So now we have something that looks like that. Alright, so once I've gone ahead and done that, let's take a look at the top and the bottom, because don't forget, when we go to view and then top, this is the top side right here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go and point to the top div, and then what I want to do is change the background color, which is going to be yellow. So what's going to happen is basically with the color scheme, what we're going to do is have the parallel faces the same color. So the front and back are parallel to each other, so they're going to be red. Top and bottom are parallel to each other, so they're going to be yellow, and the left and the right are going to be green. So what I'm going to go ahead and do is change that color right there, and also what I need to do is rotate this, but also translate it as well. So let's go ahead and take a look at Blender right here, and I'm going to add in a plane. Let's change this to solid mode right here so we can actually see what we're doing. And what I want to do is I want to move it and rotate it. So I'm going to rotate it on the x-axis by 90 degrees, but that is after, don't forget, we translate it. So right here on the y-axis, if I set this to 1, it will actually go to the top. So if I go to view top, you'll be able to see that. However, there's a little bit of a problem with the y-axis only when it comes to Blender and obviously the browser as well. And that's because in the browser, you can't say plus 100 pixels, because if you say 100 pixels, a positive number, it goes more towards the bottom rather than the top, whereas Blender is the opposite way around. So what I'm going to go ahead and do is say translate on the y-axis by, let's say, 100 pixels like we've done in Blender, and then we're going to say rotate on the x-axis by 90 degrees. So once I go ahead and do that and save it, go back into the browser, hit refresh, you'll notice that it's at the bottom of the cube. So what I'm going to go ahead and do is I'm going to change that to -100 pixels, and then obviously rotate it and hit refresh, and basically what it will do is it will go right up to the top side of our cube. And the next thing I can do is copy that, paste it, point to the bottom face right here, and again it's going to be yellow, and we're going to set this to 100 pixels. So go back, hit refresh, and there we go. Then also, the next thing they'll want to do is I want to point to the left and the right hand side, and then obviously move them into position and rotate them. So in Blender, what we can do is add in another plane right here, and as I said, it's only the y-axis that's the problem here with Blender, and obviously the browser trying to compare the two. But that's it. The x-axis is exactly how it works in the browser. So what you have is the ability to rotate on the y-axis by 90 degrees, and then if I set x to a negative value, it's going to go more over to the left, and if I set it as a positive value, it's going to go more over to the right. So if I say -1 or -100 pixels, for example, it will go over to the left. So what I'm going to go ahead and do is copy this right here, paste this down below, point to the left face, change this to green, and I'm going to say translate on the x-axis by -100 pixels. So this is going over to the left hand side, and rotating on the y-axis by 90 degrees. Easy enough. Then what I'm going to do is copy that, and obviously I'm just going to say translate on the x-axis by 100 pixels, and then very quickly just change this selector right here to say right, and then let's take a look at that in the browser, and there we go. So as you can see, we have our left and right, top and bottom, even though you can't see the top because it's pretty much flat to the camera, so you can't even see it. But however, if we inspect this now and we actually select the cube, so the cube is basically grouping all of the faces together, and we rotate the cube like so, what will happen is you'll get this awesome cube effect right here. Now, the only problem with this is obviously it's transitioning wrong, it's not really in the correct perspective, it's not where we want it to be, and it doesn't look right. in terms of the fact that when it transitions and rotates and so forth. So in the next lesson, what I'm going to be doing is covering over more about the viewport, more about your perspective and the way you're actually looking at this in the 3D scene. And also we're going to take a look at normal. So we're actually going to add content to the faces of the cube, and then we're going to try and determine what is happening, because you'll notice that when you start adding content to each one of these faces, some of them look right and others don't. So we're going to be talking about the normal side of the face. So thank you for watching this lesson, and I hope you can join me in the next one.